Okay, today we're going to finish up chapter 3 with section 4, which is about the major monotheistic faith of Judaism. Now, when you're talking about Judaism, you got to know a little bit of geography, understanding that the region that we're talking about begins in Palestine, which is located at the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea. Within Palestine is the ancient home of the Hebrews called Canaan. Now, the Hebrews would later become known as the Jewish population, or for short, the Jews. The Hebrew history, legends, and moral laws are a major influence on Western culture. Now, Roman numeral 2 explains that what the Hebrews were doing early on is searching for what is called the Promised Land. Now, Palestine's location, it made it a very important cultural crossroads of the ancient world. I want to take a look at a couple of things. To the east of Palestine is Assyria and Babylonia, two fairly powerful empires at the time. To the west is Egypt. We know a very powerful civilization. Canaan lies between the Jordan River and also the Mediterranean Sea, and it is the land that God promised to the Hebrew people according to the Bible. Now, what we're going to do here, we're going to take a look at a map that talks about this location and shows this location, I should say. So if you're following, here's Palestine, this strip of land here going along the Mediterranean Sea. Canaan is the smaller region in this area here. This is the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire. Of course, this is Egypt. So this boxed in region is more or less the part that we are talking about. And then over here, you can see on this zoomed in part, there's the kingdoms of Israel, which was the northern part of this region, and Judah. Those two had split after the death of King Solomon. This is the Sinai Peninsula. Mount Sinai is where Moses, right here, is said to have received the 10 Commandments from God. So that's a little bit of geographic overlay for you. Next, we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of the Hebrew faith and practice of Judaism. Capital B says from Ur to Egypt, and I will explain as we go. The Torah, these are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible and the most sacred writing in that tradition. For Christians, these first 5 books are part of the Old Testament. The key figure, Abraham. It's written in the Torah that God chose Abraham to be the father of the Hebrew people. In fact, his job was a shepherd in real life. He came from the Sumerian city of Ur in Mesopotamia. God commanded him to move his people to Canaan, and it's believed that he made this move around 1800 BC. Later, around 1650 BC, his descendants, so his family members that came along later, moved to Egypt. Now, the word that the Hebrews called their God was Yahweh. So one of the things that happens during this move from Canaan to Egypt is that God promised to watch over them and they would worship the single God. This is a process called monotheism. Really, monotheism is very rare during this time in history, and most civilizations, tribes were polytheistic, but monotheism is the belief in a single God, and it comes from the Greek words mono, meaning one, and theism, meaning God worship. During this process, there was something called a covenant that was created. The covenant is a mutual promise between God and the founder of the Hebrews, which was Abraham, and then his descendants. In this first covenant, Abraham promised to obey Yahweh, and in return, Yahweh promised to protect Abraham and, of course, his. Roman numeral 3 talks about Moses and the Exodus. Hebrew migration to Egypt was implemented and performed, the reason that they left, because of a drought. And when there's a drought, there's always a fear of famine. And so they needed to find a spot where there was water and irrigation. And so they decided to go to Egypt. Now, at first, they were welcomed into Egypt, but eventually they were later forced into slavery. And the reason behind that, the history behind that, is that when they actually enter into Egypt, the Hyksos were actually in charge of Egypt at the time. They had conquered Egypt, and the Hyksos were from the Palestine region. So they had a similar cultural practice. However, the Egyptians eventually took Egyptian power back, expelling the Hyksos, and then when they come into power, they turned the Hebrews into slaves because the Hebrews would not be willing to worship the multiple polytheistic Egyptian gods. The Hebrews then fled Egypt sometime between 1300 and 1200 BC. This event is commonly known as the Exodus, and it is celebrated each year at Passover. The Torah also states that Moses was the man who's responsible for leading the Hebrews out of slavery. Now, the story about Moses is that he was born in Egypt, and he was his mother put him in a basket in the river, and then he was taken in by the Pharaoh's family, and he was close friends with Ramses II, who eventually became the Pharaoh. And the whole idea is that God created him to do this job of the Exodus. Capital letter E talks about the new covenant now. Once he parts the Red Sea, they cross over the Red Sea back into what is modern-day Sinai Peninsula. Moses climbs to the top of Mount Sinai to pray. The Bible says he spoke to God, and when he returned, he brought down 2 stone tablets on which there were inscribed the 10 Commandments. Now, in your textbook on page 79, you can find the 10 Commandments. What's important is that these commandments form the basis of civil and religious law in Judaism. And I would argue that the 10 Commandments sort of form the basis for civil law in the modern world as well. These laws formed what's known as a new covenant between God and the Hebrew people, and that was that God promised to protect the Hebrews if they promised to keep God's 10 Commandments. So this sort of replaces the old covenant, the first covenant, with this promise, this mutual promise between God and his followers. Capital F says land and people of the Bible. After the death of Moses and a series of nomadic wanderings near the desert of Sinai, the Hebrews returned to the region of Canaan. At Canaan, the Hebrews changed from a nomadic tribal society to settled herders, farmers, and also city dwellers. They began to learn new technology from the neighboring peoples in ancient Palestine. So they created civilization, they created cities, just like some of the earlier groups that we've learned, Sumer, Egypt, so on and so forth. Capital G talks about the 12 tribes. At Canaan, the Hebrews were organized into 12 separate and distinct tribes. These tribes were self-governing. However, in times of crisis, the Bible explains that God would select judges that would invite the tribes and provide judicial and military leadership. A little bit about Hebrew law. First of all, women were not allowed to officiate at religious ceremonies. In general, women were not treated as equal to men, and they were expected to focus on raising children. This is a little different from some of the other ancient societies that we've learned about. The 10 Commandments were part of a code of laws that God delivered to Moses, and the code included other rules regulating social and religious behavior. This practice is called ethical monotheism. What it means is it's not enough to just worship one God. There's an emphasis on the proper conduct and also worshiping one God. So following the 10 Commandments, obeying God's rules, acting appropriately, and then also worshiping only one God. Roman numeral 4 is going to talk about how Israel, this region, Palestine, eventually becomes a kingdom. 2 of the first and most famous figures and leaders of Israel are Saul and David. Point 1, eventually, as the Hebrews expanded from Canaan, there was only one tribe left. That tribe was known as Judah. Therefore, Hebrews came to be called Jews, and their religion, Judaism. During the period of 1020 all the way down to 922 BC, the Hebrews united under 3 very able kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. This new kingdom was called Israel. Saul was the first of the 3 kings and was chosen largely because of his success in driving out the Philistines from ancient Palestine. David, his son-in-law, was later king after Saul's death. He was extremely popular as a leader. He was known for uniting the remaining tribes, establishing Jerusalem as the capital city, and founding a dynasty. He's the same David from the story of David and Goliath. Saul was the king during the story of David and Goliath, and David defeats Goliath, which drives out the Philistines. Next, we'll take a look at Solomon. There is a nice insert in the textbook on page 81 about Solomon. We'll go ahead and take a look at that real quick. Here's Solomon right here. We're not exactly sure when he ruled, but most believe 962 to around 922. And it talks about the fact that Solomon would pray to God for an understanding mind, and he was known for being a very wise fellow. Okay, Solomon succeeded David, who was his father, in 962 BC. He was most well known for building a great temple at Jerusalem to glorify God and to hold the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the tablets of Moses' law. Capital C says the kingdom divides. Solomon's building projects required pretty heavy taxation and put a lot of strain on the kingdom's finances. Citizens were also forced into spending time working at the temple. The expense and the forced labor created discontent. After Solomon's death, which took place in 922, the Jews in the region actually split into two separate kingdoms when the northern portion rebelled. By 922, the kingdom had divided in two distinct parts. In the north was Israel still, and in the south was Judah. As we move forward in history, eventually there's a famous time period known as the Babylonian captivity. Israel in the north would fall. In 738, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were conquered by the Assyrians and forced to pay tribute. Tribute is basically peace money paid by a weaker power to a stronger one. In essence, I'll use the example of the Assyrians. The Assyrians would come in, they would defeat you in battle, and then they would ask you to pay massive amounts of tribute. And basically, if you didn't pay that tribute, they would come in and try to kill everyone. And they were very ruthless. And this happened in Israel. The Assyrians in 725 were not happy enough with the tribute that they were being paid. They laid siege to Samaria, which was the capital of Israel, and they took the entire kingdom over. Capital B, a similar thing is going to happen to Judah, but it's going to happen by way of the Babylonians. Judah hung on to control for another 150 years. The Babylonians, though, were this time responsible for the destruction of Judah, because after the Assyrians had conquered Israel, the Babylonians had conquered them. There was a famous Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar. He ran the Egyptians out of Syria. He also ran them out of ancient Palestine, and he twice had attacked Jerusalem in Judah. In 586 BC, the Babylonians finally defeated the Hebrews and destroyed the famous temple that Solomon had constructed. Many of the survivors were actually exiled, taken into what's called captivity to the city of Babylon, where the famous prophet Ezekiel urged his people to keep their religion alive, even though they're being held in a foreign land. This exile is called the Babylonian captivity. So they were taken in basically as a form of slave or prisoner by the Babylonians, which were at this time known as the Chaldeans. Nebuchadnezzar was a Chaldee king, and so about 50 years later, they were being held in this state of slavery. In 539, the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon. Cyrus allowed about 40,000 exiles to return to Jerusalem in an effort to rebuild their temple. However, many Jewish practitioners chose to stay in Babylon. Nonetheless, a new temple was constructed in 515 BC. Thus ends chapter 3.